Hello, classmates. Welcome to International Trade class. This lecture, we will discuss subsidies. National governments sometimes grant subsidies to their producers to help improve their market position. Governmental subsidies assume a variety of forms, including outright cash disbursements, tax concessions, insurance arrangements, and loans at below-market interest rates. Two types of subsidies can be distinguished: a domestic production subsidy that is granted to producers of import-competing goods, and an export subsidy which goes to producers of goods that are to be sold overseas. In both cases, the government adds an amount to the price the purchasers pay rather than subtracting from it. The net price actually received by the producer equals the price paid by the purchaser plus the subsidy. The subsidized producer is thus able to supply a greater quantity at this price. Both of these subsidies will have effects on the nation's trade and welfare. Let's first look at the domestic production subsidy. The purpose of a domestic production subsidy is to encourage the output and thus vitality of import-competing producers. Suppose the U.S. has no advantage in steel producing. Please look at Figure 1. The initial market equilibrium price is $430 per ton, but the world price is $400 per ton. Assume the U.S. is a small buyer of steel. Changes in its purchase do not affect the world price. Given a free trade price of $400 per ton, the United States consumes 40 million tons of steel, produces 2 million tons, and imports 12 million tons. To partially insulate domestic producers from foreign competition, suppose the U.S. government grants them a production subsidy of $25 per ton of steel. The cost advantage made by the subsidy results in a right shift in the U.S. supply schedule from U.S. 0 to U.S. 1. Domestic production expands from 2 to 7 million tons, and the imports fall from 12 to 7 million tons. These changes represent the subsidy's trade effect. The subsidy also affects the national welfare for the United States. The subsidy permits U.S. output to rise to 7 million tons. At this output, the net price to the steel maker is $425. The sum of the price paid by the consumer, $400, plus the subsidy, $25. To the U.S. government, the total cost of protecting its steel makers equals the amount of the subsidy, $25, times the amount of output to which it's applied, 7 million tons, or $175 million. Where does this subsidy revenue go? Part of it is redistributed to the more efficient U.S. producers in the form of a producer surplus. This amount is denoted by area A. There is also a protective effect, whereby more costly domestic output is allowed to be sold in the market as a result of the subsidy. This effect is denoted by area B. The domestic production subsidy doesn't have effect on the U.S. consumers. To the United States as a whole, the protective effect represents a deadweight loss of welfare. To encourage production by its import competing producers, a government might levy tariffs or quotas on imports. Tariffs and quotas involve large sacrifices in national welfare that occur under an equivalent subsidy. Unlike subsidies, tariffs and quotas distort choices for domestic consumers, resulting in a decrease in the domestic demand for imports, in addition to the permitting less efficient home production to occur. The result is a familiar consumption effect of protection, whereby a deadweight loss of the consumer surplus is borne by the home nation. This welfare loss is absent in the subsidy case. A subsidy tends to yield the same result for domestic producers as does in an equivalent tariff or quota, but at a lower cost in terms of the nation's welfare. Rather than granting a production subsidy to import computation producers, a government could pay a subsidy on exports only. When begin with a small home country that faces a fixed world price for its exports, consider a small country exporting sugar. Please look at Figure 2. The whole no-trade equilibrium is at point A. With free trade, home faces the world price of sugar PW. The quantity supplied in home at that price is S1, and the quantity demanded is D1 tons of sugar. Because quantity demanded is less than quantity supplied, the home country exports X1 equal S1 minus D1 tons on the free trade. Now suppose that because the government wishes to boost the exports of the domestic sugar producers, each ton of sugar exported receives a subsidy of S dollars from the government. With an export subsidy of S dollars per ton, exporters will receive PW plus S for each ton exported rather than the lower free trade price PW. Because they are allowed to export any amount they want at the subsidized price, the home firms will not accept a price less than PW plus S for their domestic sales. If the domestic price was less than PW plus S, the firm would just export all their sugar at the higher price. Thus, the domestic price for sugar must rise to PW plus S, so that it equals the export price received by home firms. With the price rising to PW plus S, the quantity supplied in home increases to S2, while the quantity demanded falls to D2. Therefore, home exports increase to X2 minus D2. So from the domestic perspective, the export subsidy increases both the price and the quantity of exports. The rise in home price lowers consumer surplus by the amount A plus B. On the other hand, the price increases raises producer surplus by the amount A plus B plus C. Finally, we need to determine the effect on government revenue. The export subsidy costs the government's S per unit exported, or S times X2 in total. That revenue cost is shown by the area B plus C plus D. Adding up the impact on consumers, producers, and the government revenue, the overall impact of the export subsidy is minus B plus D. So an export subsidy unambiguously leads to cost that exceed its benefits. The result that an export subsidy leads to a deadweight loss for the exporter is similar to the result that a tariff leads to a deadweight loss for an importing country. The triangle D can be interpreted as the production loss for the economy. The area of the triangle B can be interpreted as the drop in consumer surplus for those individuals no longer consuming the units between D1 and D2, which we call the consumption loss for the economy. The combination of the production and the consumption losses is the deadweight loss for the exporting country. Now suppose that the home country is a large enough seller on international markets so that its subsidy affects the world price of the sugar. For example, this occurs with European sugar subsidies and the US cotton subsidies. Please look at Figure 3. Under free trade, the home and world price is PW. Suppose that home applies a subsidy of $S per ton of sugar exported. The price in the home country rises from PW to PS, while the price in the importing country falls from PW to PS star, so the price increase is less than the subsidy. In the home country or export country, consumers are hurt, producers gain, and the government losses because it must expend money on the subsidy. The consumer loss is the area A plus B. The producer gain is the area A plus B plus C. The government subsidy, the amount of exports times the amount of the subsidy, is the area B plus C plus D plus E plus F plus G. The net welfare loss is therefore the sum of the areas B plus D plus E plus F plus G. Of this, B and D represent consumption and the production distortion losses of the same kind that are tariff producers. In addition, and in contrast to a tariff, the export subsidy worsens the terms of trade because it lowers the price of the export in the world market from PW to PS star. This leads to the additional terms of trade losses E plus F plus G, which is equal PW minus PS star times the quantity exported with subsidy. So for a large exporting country, the export subsidy leads to much more costs. By now, we have learned two subsidies. We find that compared with export subsidies, domestic production subsidies will result a small deadweight loss. For this reason, the WTO is less concerned with eliminating production subsidies and other forms of domestic support for agriculture.